Okay everyone, hello, how are you? And hope you're doing well. And you'll notice that the last unit of the course you've been answering questions about is aesthetics, which raises several questions. Is art objective or subjective? Is it in the eye of the beholder? Is it something independent of the individual perceiver? But all those questions have to come back to the original question of trying to define what art is. Philosophy has tried to do that at various times in various ways. So the question is, what is art? At the outset of that section, which is a very good chapter in the book, one of the strongest chapters, there are three answers. One is this answer that Expressionism gives. Expressionism, not to be confused with the 19th century movement in art. The French Expressionists, for one, it's not to do with that. Expressionism is the idea that art is the expression of emotion. That's where this definition gets its name from. It goes back to Tolstoy, at least, where Tolstoy says it's the purpose of art to infect the viewer with the same emotions that the artist had. So that art is the expression of emotion, and the highest state of that expression is when the artist has the same view as the viewer has. That is to say, the viewer has the same internal sense that the artist had while creating the painting. So there's a kind of one-to-one correspondence between what the artist had in mind and what the observer of the art had in mind. This could apply, we're talking about visual art, observer, but it could apply to auditory art, music, it could apply to sculpture, it could apply to any kinds of art. That's what the idea is about. So first let's try to argue the theory in strong light and before criticizing it. So you can take any painting and, for example, and like the death of Socrates, which we looked at when we did the unit on Socrates weeks back, and there's a beautiful painting, you can look at it for the purposes of this lecture, and by Jacques-Louis David, who is a neoclassicist, and he shows Socrates about to drink the hemlock that will kill him after he's been condemned to death by the Athenian jury. Now, the painting is very expressive by David of his respect and awe of Socrates and the way he is calm in the face of death. And so certainly that feeling, you can pick out paintings like that in dozens of others, and where there's a feeling of the artist is pretty clear, and there is an expression of emotion there. Can't be doubted, really looking at that painting, that David had nothing but, in this neoclassicist way, trying to revive the classics, sort of like Renaissance, the movement in art, which Renaissance of course means rebirth, neoclassicism means much the same. There can be no doubt that his emotion there towards Socrates, not critical, but his admiration. Go back to what Tolstoy said, is when it reaches its highest pitch, when the viewer has the same emotion that the artist has. I'd have to say that I have that same kind of feeling for Socrates too. There's very few people who know philosophy who are wholly critical or even partly critical of Socrates' life. The life he talked about, he lived. And so there's that in Socrates. There's certainly that course. So I think it works in many kinds of cases. Can't be denied that it works in those kinds of cases. Anyone who has the same feeling as what the artist had, or something similar, but it doesn't have to be exact, shows Expressionism in a strong light. On the other hand, if you want to be critical of Expressionism, certainly you could look at Starry Night by Van Gogh, and which was written about a year before his death. And it's very expressive of his looking out of the window of a sanitarium in France of a village that reminded him of his native Netherlands. So there's no doubt that it's expressive. Yet it can't fulfill the second part of what Tolstoy said, is that the viewer will have the same emotion the artist have. Because in this case, the artist was severely depressed and about 1 year from killing himself with a gunshot wound to the chest. So what are the chances that you, looking at that, have similar emotions? So your emotions do not correspond to the artist in that case, and yet we can appreciate it nonetheless. So I don't think that that's a requirement that we have to have the same emotions as the artist. And then I have other, before moving on to formalism, the second definition, I have another criticism of this. What this really says, this theory says, is that emotion is essential to art. So that if you have the expression of emotion, if E for emotion, then you have A, art. I'm going to reverse that, if A, then E. Not necessarily. A work of art can be angry, it can be joyous, and just because it is angry or joyous, or it shows those kinds of emotions, doesn't mean that it's art. A lot of things could be unskillful and still show anger or joyousness. So I'm not going to say that if you have just a mere expression of emotion, that's art. That would make anyone who's expressing emotion an artist. And we can think of, well, people can make dot paintings, can have some emotion of glee while doing it, doesn't mean they've expressed art. Let's flip it. If something is art, does that mean it's the expression of emotion? Well, this is probably closer to the intent of the definition, but again, I don't think that that would necessarily work. That would make art is the expression of emotion analytic, and we did analytic statements where the subject implies the predicate. That's kind of what this is saying here, that if you have art, it expresses emotion. Yet I can imagine, as a counter-argument, I can imagine a work of art, something being highly skillful, and yet the artist had no emotion at all while doing it. Just was emotionless. What you see is the skill of the painting or the sculpture or the work of music, and I'm not saying that that's commonplace, but it's at least possible. So none of those, even though we can find cases where art is emotive and expresses emotion, none of those definitions ultimately withstand criticism. Let's move on to the second. Formalism says that art, this goes back to Clive Bell, an art historian, and I think his book was in 1914 on art, said that art equals significant form. So the form that we're talking about in the artist, in the work of art, has to be significant. We'd have to know what that is. What does it mean? What is significant form? Is that something subjective or objective? A building in 1931, such as the Empire State Building, is a significant form. It's the culmination of a whole period of building skyscrapers that began in the early 1900s, and this one's the tallest, and so it's significant that during that period, when architects were trying to make the buildings very high and beautiful, those are the two objectives, that it's significant for that period. That comes to mind. Also, the form of paintings. Da Vinci's Last Supper has a definite form, as does the aforementioned Death of Socrates. Da Vinci's Last Supper has Christ centered and disciples 6 on either side. So there's a kind of significant balance to that painting, as the balance is shown in the School of Athens, if you want to look up that painting, with Socrates and Plato at the center, and all these other figures from ancient, and not just Athens, but ancient, medieval, Renaissance philosophy around them. And the Death of Socrates, where Socrates is again centered, and there are 12 other people besides Socrates, so David was influenced by Da Vinci in that case. But sometimes what is significant form will be in the eye of the beholder. What would be, we can see form, but is that significant form? That sounds like a value judgment. It is in fact a value judgment. That it has to be not just any form by the artist, but significant form. Also, form can refer to the medium in which it's painted, which it's done. So it can be acrylic or oil or watercolor. Is that what's meant by form here? Probably not. Form probably means something like shape or structure, going back to Aristotle. But I can think of other cases, to be generous to the definition, where people like Cubism, Picasso's period of Cubism, he has a bridge with landscape, one painting, in which you see nothing but geometric shapes making up this landscape and a bridge. So those are forms in a literal sense. We're familiar with these rhombuses and triangles and arches from our geometry days, but does that make them significant in and of themselves? So this is You know, again, if I see a painting with just stripes in the Museum of Modern Art, does it have, is that significant form? I tend to think not. To me, it's not significant at all. Maybe to the artist it was, maybe to some viewer, but that definition doesn't work unless you can point to something objective that is form. There's an objective form, and that form is significant. So that definition will, it's a good attempt at a definition, and it's good that philosophy tries to define these things. I don't find other people trying to define it necessarily. They'll say that something is art, and yet they have no definition of what art is, so how would they know what is art and what is not art? Finally, the aesthetic experience definition has some promise, but it says in effect that art is that which produces an aesthetic experience in the observer, it could be listener, it could be viewer, that can be gotten in no other way. Okay, so the only way you can get this aesthetic experience is by viewing the work of art. So the aesthetic experience could be awe, it could be disappointment, it could be inquisitiveness, it can be anything that crosses your mind when you look at the work of art. There's two kinds, as is noted in the text. The one kind is the subjective kind, where the artist, the art historian, or the art critic notes what the observer's state of mind or condition of mind is while listening or viewing the work of art. That's, to me, less significant, and the other kind, the second kind of aesthetic experience, is not just noting what's in the observer's head, but what is in the work of art itself. What is in Da Vinci's David, or what is in Socrates, what is in David's Death of Socrates. Here, the requirement is that you not only report on what's in your mind, but you report on what's on the canvas. That seems to me to be more significant, more telling. You should be able to somehow prove up and say, if this is a work of art, point to something about the work of art itself that makes it art, not just something going on in the corridors of your mind. That's not enough. If I say to me, this painting with dots all over speaks to me of chaos, I still have to say, what is it about that work that where there's chaos present in there? It can't just be some factor in my head. So that's the second version of the aesthetic experience. My criticism of this theory is that aesthetic experiences can run the gamut, it seems to me, a kind of entire spectrum of aesthetic experiences. I could be awed by something on the one extreme, but they can run all the way to repulsed, let's say, where you look at a work of art and think that it has no value whatsoever, like artist shit, the can of excrement that this artist, Italian artist, did, who Pietro, who died when he was 30. You know, what's there in that? So my point being that if we're going to note the aesthetic experience, the aesthetic experience must be qualitative. We must be able to say the aesthetic experience caused in me a feeling of awe, as Rembrandt might, let's say, or Michelangelo, or David, or Da Vinci, or any of these masters. We can say there's something really magnificent going on there. Would we say the same for art, things that are called art that repulse you? That's because that's an experience, that's an emotion. My aesthetic experience is being repulsed, therefore it's art. That sounds like a bad argument, for it's repulsed premise, therefore it's art conclusion. Doesn't seem to be a good kind of argument. Maybe it's non-art, which could be the same as bad art. So that's the beginning of that chapter, how he sets it up. Those theories need to be gone over quite a bit, so that's all I have for you for now. We'll talk again one more time.